Well, thank you so much, Professor Tormey, for joining our interview series. I want to start right away with the first question. In your article titled Stresses and Strains, Will We Ever Agree on What's Going Wrong with Democracy? You discuss the chronic nature of democracy's crisis under capitalist conditions. How do you think current global economic trends, such as rising inequality and economic uncertainty, are influencing this crisis and the public's perception of democracy?
Well, it's a bit of a leading question, isn't it? I mean, we are in an era of, I think, polycrisis is the modern term, isn't it? That we've got economic crisis, we've got climate emergency, we've got geopolitical risks aplenty, land war in Europe, threats of wars elsewhere in the world, poverty, starvation, political instability. This is all the stuff on which populism thrives, I think, because what it does is to destabilize our sense that the political elites are really in control and can be trusted to come to bring about a better situation. So to me, we can't really think about populism without crisis, and we can't think about crisis without populism. These two things are very closely intertwined. So, and we can see that very clearly in Europe, where you're calling from, where, you know, we have a kind of confected immigration crisis, and this fuels then the far right in, of course, Italy currently got a far right leader. Holland has just sorted out a government. We've got the British, who are trying desperately to avoid tumbling into a sort of populist right-wing formula for dealing with its immigration problem. Ireland will probably turn right quite soon. And of course, we've got the run-up to the French presidential election in 2027 as well. And it looks like the far right are going to do very well in the next European elections. So I just think that, and I mean, the other point that we'll come on to is, of course, all of this is amplified by contemporary sort of media takes on these things. Crisis is also what the media feeds off, and the media also then generates a sense of kind of collective doom, images from Palestine, from benighted parts of the world, and so on. This is really feeding the kind of sense, particularly amongst young people, that we are going to hell in a handcart, and that only those with radical, rather simplistic solutions that get to the root of the problem are going to help us out here. So I do think that contemporary democracy has amplified crisis, our sense of being in a crisis, but also then that populism is feeding off that and making the life of a once calmer technocratic elite much harder as the days go past.
All right. In your discussion of the democratic crisis, you mentioned that the global financial crisis and subsequent austerity measures accelerated certain negative traits in liberal democracy, leading to the rise of populism. How do you see the interplay between economic factors and political populism evolving in the current global landscape?
Well, again, I think they're very intimately interconnected. We've got to think that really before the global financial crisis, interest in populism was quite limited in my field, in political science. It was a few people interested in quite curious idiosyncratic movements, the Narodniks in Russia, some idiosyncratic figures in the US in the 1920s and 30s, and maybe Caudillo movements and parties in Latin America. But what really sparks our contemporary interest in populism is the global financial crisis, which brings into question the competence and trustworthiness of the elites, which had been leading Western Europe and places like Australia, New Zealand, the US, and so on. And from that, we get two kinds of reaction, it seems to me. One, which is the sort of right-wing populist approach, which is that open markets, free borders, cosmopolitanism has led us into this terrible sense of interconnectedness, where problems in one side of the world then immediately impact on another side of the world, and we have to have a backlash against that. So I think Trump is very much part of that sort of right-wing backlash against open markets and cosmopolitanism. But on the other hand, of course, the global financial crisis also provokes a left-wing reaction. Initially, Syriza in Greece, but then we get the Spanish kind of citizens' revolutions, Podemos, and all sorts of Corbyn in Britain as well, anti-austerity movements, which also deploy a sort of populist tropes, us against the people versus the elites, and the whole sense of the European Union as a project as being a kind of pro-capitalist, pro-austerity kind of an organization. So I think the contemporary wave of populism is very much sparked by global financial crisis and in all sorts of different manifestations. So we have a right-wing backlash, we have a left-wing backlash, but certainly I think, and Mark Blythe is the one who really kind of accentuates this in his work. I think he's very justified in talking about populism as being a sort of, the failure of neoliberalism, if you like, or the questioning of neoliberalism gave rise to these kind of approaches. The problem that we've got as populism scholars is, of course, that populism predates the financial crisis. So it's something which is more intrinsic to democratic life than simply a backlash or a reaction to economic crisis. There have been populist movements, as we mentioned, really since the middle to the late 19th century. So there is something more, to me, there's something more deeply involved in thinking about populism than simply a response to financial crisis. I think to me, it's much more of a political position that really wants to position the elites as complicit in the tough times that the people are having. And those tough times can be expressed in economic terms, but they can also be expressed in other kind of terms. And of course, there is always a dynamic in unequal societies between those who want to claim that the people are being used or abused by elites for their own purposes. That is just intrinsic in unequal societies. It's particularly intrinsic to feudal societies, aristocratic societies, and in our own day in capitalist societies where inequality is kind of baked into the DNA of the structures that we've got.
Given your discussion on the decline of traditional party-based representative politics and the emergence of new forms of political engagement, what do you consider the most promising alternatives to traditional democratic structures for addressing the current democratic stress? Additionally, what role will populist parties and leaders play in either exacerbating this crisis or potentially mitigating the crisis of representation and democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think populism, starting with the latter part of that question, I think populism is an interesting case because, in a sense, what populist leaders are saying is that we, the voiceless, need a voice. I can be that voice for the voiceless. So it's a kind of almost a paradoxical response to the crisis of representation to me, which is why I didn't say too much in my 2015 book about this, because it kind of predated some of these figures coming along. But I think populism is a kind of paradoxical sort of hyper representation. It's a representation of the people against those who are supposed to be representing the people's interests. But of course, on the other side of the coin, we have all sorts of democratic innovations going on, which I think are very linked to the kind of technological advances we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, which have been well documented by people like Lance Bennett and Clay Shirky and all sorts of people who are interested in the kind of the impact of digital mechanisms for increasing the degree to which people can find each other, frankly. Some of this it gets written off by political scientists as slacktivism or clicktivism, those kind of phrases. But certainly in my researches, I was quite convinced that things like just Twitter flash mobs, Facebook organizations, what we've been able to do is to flatten the forms of organizational life so that they look very different now to what they did even sort of 30, 40 years ago. And in fact, the whole modus operandi of a political party came into question, it seemed to me. But what also I didn't see before I started researching these things more carefully in Spain was that we now have things like instant political parties. So it's not the political party has been made moribund by new technologies. It's that the political party itself has become transformed so that now we have an array of types of political party. It used to be, kind of mainstream political parties, and then these political parties like fascist parties and communist parties seeking to establish themselves as kind of very well structured organizations. Well, what I saw in Spain, pop-up parties, single issue parties, flash parties, parties that were anti-representational even in terms of their own constitution. They wanted to make themselves disappear. So I think what we've got is a vastly enlarged repertoire of forms of representation, some of which are paradoxically anti-representative. But I do agree with kind of someone like Ernesto Laclau, who says that in a sense, they're all forms of representation, even those that are anti-representative or anti-elite or anti the inherited ways of doing politics, still have a representative claim. I'm still representing you and your deepest needs and so on. So I think the big challenge has been to theories of representation. So that whole inherited literature on why we need political parties to represent us, I think has come into amazing kind of dismembering, dismantling, reprogramming, and so on, because of the impact, frankly, of social media technologies and digital mechanisms of making ourselves heard and met and greet others with similar problems to ourselves. So I do think that, so the net result of all this, I do think democracies are as lively as ever. I don't think we've lost the energy to want to come together, to want to participate, to want to be heard, to want to make our grievances heard, and so on. It's just the mechanisms for doing that have become, very, very plural and very kind of, we're still finding out about which ones are really effective and which ones aren't. So we can see that in all sorts of young people's protests today, for example.
You highlight that some theorists view the democratic crisis as a permanent and endemic condition, while others see it as episodic and short-lived. How do you think these differing perspectives influence the strategies proposed to address the democratic crisis? You also argue that the term stress might be more appropriate than crisis. Can you elaborate on specific actions and reforms that could help alleviate this democratic stress and strengthen democratic institutions?
Yeah, I think at one level, I do kind of share David Runciman's view of democratic crisis, which is that, in a sense, democracies are systems of crisis. It's another point that we might agree with Taleb about as well, isn't it? That they're kind of anti-fragile. So democracies, in a sense, provoke crises, respond to crises, and this is one of their strengths. So that if we think then as democracy as a kind of style of crisis management, that rather prompts the question then that crisis isn't necessarily an existential threat to democracy. It's actually what democracies are designed to manage and to organize and so on. There's always a crisis. We had COVID crisis, now we've got geopolitical crisis, climate crisis, and so on. So democracies are remarkably permeable, remarkably malleable, remarkably resistant to the kind of existential crises that people who talk about crises might be interested in. So on the other hand, we might then talk about democratic stresses. So things that press up against or impact how democracy functions. So when people close down a national newspaper, or when they threaten insurrection, or when they do things which kind of imperil the way, the modus operandi of democracy, we might say that these are kind of, stresses, if you like, and that what we need to be mindful of is that democracy is a kind of civilizational thing. It's a way of life, as well as a set of institutions or a set of practices. So how we arm ourselves against those things, I think, is I'm still surprised how weak education features in the accounts of those who are in favor of democracy. We don't teach in most countries of the world citizenship. We don't try to enthuse our young people with the kind of heritage and inheritance of democratic structures. We do very little. I mean, I'm thinking about here in Australia, but I was also in the UK recently. Very little in terms of a kind of civics, a civic education of the kind that we might associate with someone like, I don't know, some of the late 19th century thinkers like J.S. Mill or Henry Thoreau, people who were very keen that our young people understand and nurture democracy. But one thing I would say, for example, in the Australian case, we have compulsory voting. Now, I wasn't really in favor of that when I moved to Australia, because I'm a sort of a sort of small L libertarian, in the sense I prefer people to make up their own minds about how best to act. But I think I've seen the impact of compulsory voting on my own children and on their friends and on students generally. You have to have a stake in the system. So that kind of forces you to get off the fence and to stop blaming others for the situation that you find yourself in. So I think, so if we thought about civics, if we thought about compulsory voting, if we thought about involving citizens more directly in deliberative juries or in citizen juries and so on, I think there are all sorts of really quite interesting little innovations there, which might take the heat off some of the things that we've been talking about, in terms of it's all about the elites and it's all about the actions of people in Canberra or in Brussels or in London and so on. If we thought about democracy as really a practice and as something that everybody should have the opportunity to be engaged with, and really that there is an obligation to engage with it as far as voting is concerned, as far as other kinds of ways in which we can interact with our elite systems, then in a sense we all become complicit, and that shared sense of responsibility, I think, would be a useful kind of armoring against the wilder flights of fancy that we can see being proposed by some populist leaders out there.
In your article published in 2015 and titled "Democracy Will Never Be the Same Again, 21st Century Protest and Transformation of Politics," you discussed the emergence of new forms of political mobilization, such as cloud, swarm, and connective initiatives. How do these new forms challenge traditional organizational structures, and what implications do they have for the future of representative liberal democracy?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, in another bit of the political science literature, we talk about the difference between vertical organizations, political parties being that kind, and horizontal political organizations being another. So the horizontality being commitment to a very kind of open style of participation, no leaders, nobody represents the movement, the groups, and so on. And I think we've seen this several times in recent history, for example, with the Occupy movement, with the Indignados movement in Spain, with the Arab Spring, and so on. I mean, I think these kind of innovations are, as I said, technologically driven. I mean, that's not to say that people didn't believe in horizontal structures coming out of the classical anarchist tradition, or even coming out of Marxist or socialist traditions and so on. I think they've just been more easy to operationalize as far as social movements are concerned. But on the other hand, the other recent lesson is that even these kind of movements are still representing. So even the Indignados, a very broad social base, they're making claims. They're talking about we, the 99%. They're talking about the failures of the elites. They're talking about what needs to be done. So even the most horizontal movement is representational. And the other kind of fiction I think many of us have had in our heads, even the most horizontal movement also has vertical elements to it. So I think one of the things that we've learned about this binary between vertical and horizontal is that it's not really a binary. Many vertical organizations can have quite elaborate forms of participation, engagement, and so on. The modern political party is a very different beast to what it was 40 or 50 years ago. They have all sorts of open structures, they have consultations, they have mechanisms of self-control, accountability, and so on. And equally, horizontal structures, the social movement structures, need to be a bit more transparent and accountable about who is actually leading, how they're organizing themselves, what are the rules and regulations by which they permit access of diverse actors and so on, make sure they've got a gender balance in terms of their platform and so on. So I think all of these things point to me towards the requirement for greater sophistication about what organization means, how we organize. We need to be more visible, more accountable, more transparent. And I think this is all of a piece with the kind of zeitgeist that we inhabit. You'll hear many of these themes coming about in universities, for example, university governance, business governance, corporate governance. I think the world is now less inured to hierarchy and to asymmetry generally, and more inured to democracy, accountability, transparency in whatever kind of organizational form that takes. So I think that the contemporary mind is kind of democratic, if you like. We want the people to be present as far as possible, and we need to make sure that we inaugurate and preserve mechanisms that enable that to take place.
You highlight the decline in trust and participation in traditional electoral politics and the rise of anti-representative movements. Do you see these movements as capable of sustaining long-term political engagement and effecting substantial policy changes, or are they more likely to remain episodic and focused on immediate issues? What kind of populism-proof democracy are you envisaging?
So I think, yeah, I mean, this is really a kind of institutionalizing of social energies question, isn't it? And again, I go back to my field work in Spain, where, you know, you have initially a whole set of street demonstrations, then you have sort of semi-permanent encampments. And then, of course, people cannot sustain that level of engagement anymore. People have got to go to look after children, care for old people, go to work, finish their studies, and so on. And so institutionalization is really intrinsic to political life. Agnes Heller, the famous political philosopher, made this observation to me when I interviewed her about 30 years ago. She said, you know, we can't just have the polis. We can't have a demos which is permanently sitting and imagine that that's a coherent and plausible answer to democratic deficit. People have got lives to lead. They've got things that need to get done. They need to prepare food. They need to look after the sick and the elderly and so on. So you have to institutionalize. I think the sign of a healthy democracy, however, is that we have both these moments very vividly enacted. So we have the institutional dimension, but we also have that sort of sense of citizens participating, whether it's in street protests or whether it's in, you know, creating new Facebook groups or having that kind of freedom to develop all sorts of ways in which they can be heard. And some of those will be brief and fleeting, and some of them will be institutionalized. I mean, the example that comes out of Spain, of course, out of the street protests was out of the Indignados was Podemos. And also then the other, what they call confluential political parties and movements that brought Ada Colau to power in Barcelona, Manuela Carmena to power in Madrid. They were street protesters. They were social movement types, but they were borne along by the organizational forms that came out of those movements. And now, of course, we're left now with no demonstrations, a little bit of kind of noise from neighborhood communities and committees and so on, but political parties. And in a few years' time, those political parties will themselves be challenged. I think that's a very healthy way of thinking about the ecology of democratic life, is that we need both. We need both those kind of institutions. We need political parties, but we also really need the clamor provided by street protests and by unorthodox and new forms of political participation as well. If you only have one without the other, you've got trouble. So if you've only got street protests and you've only got a clamor of a public which is not trusting its political elites, you're close to breakdown. You're getting into kind of post-Chavez Venezuela, Argentina type scenarios. But if you've only got a traditional party system as well, and you don't have any kind of citizen participation outside of beyond political parties, you've got a very stale system which is kind of ripe to be challenged by people who've got vigorous kind of social agendas that they want to move on. So I think democracy needs both those things.
In your article, Populism, Democracy's Pharmacon, you argue that framing populism as either negative or positive is, in important sense, unsatisfactory. Taking into consideration the fact that populism is usually construed negatively, can you please elaborate on the positive side of populism?
Sure. So I think that we came through a period in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s, where basically a lot of the books in political science was about why citizens were turning off, why they were apathetic, why they were bored, and so on. And the reason for that is that we basically had a kind of technocratic consensus around neoliberalism, the centrality of the market, cosmopolitanism, this is how the world is going to go, and so on. And so what shakes that kind of system is, of course, the global financial crisis comes along, but also the claims of those who come along and say, you know, there is more to democratic debate and discussion than what is being discussed by this consensus. This consensus is taking us into a space of lack of contestation, technocratic governance, and the citizens aren't being heard. And it's often populists who brought that energy and that sense of emotion into the public. Now, we might not like, you know, depending on your ideological orientation, left-wing people won't like the far-right populists or the right-wing populists, and right-wing people and culturalists and nativists won't like the left-wing thing. But it's undeniable that, in a sense, our politics was challenged, was shaken in a way which I think was probably needed with hindsight. I think we were walking sleeping blindfolded into really the kind of collapse of democratic life of the kind that I think is really intrinsic to democracies. We didn't really have a debate. Everybody agreed with each other, but the citizens kind of got it. They knew that they weren't really needed. We had a democracy without citizen engagement and without the sense of contingency and emotion about the fate and fortune of the collectives that the populists brought with them. So I saw that very closely in Spain at close hand. That was a left-wing set of responses to global financial crisis. But, you know, people like Ada Colau and Manuela Carmena, Podemos self-declared populists. I'm not accusing them of being popular. They said we needed populism. Syriza needed populism. Jeremy Corbyn, for the many, not the few. These are populist phrases. Occupy. These are all, I think, populist movements. And what they did was to shake our sense that we had to take whatever the elites brought to us by way of medicine. So they re-energized politics. They re-energized the sense of possibility for citizens at a time when it looked harmless. So to me, that I use that parable of the pharmacon as a way of saying that, you know, sometimes shaking the tree hard is a necessary antidote to the opposite, which is boredom, paralysis, apathy on behalf of citizens. Where it leads, of course, is then dependent on the nature and the forms of the populist movements that are given rise to in those kind of moments of crisis and urgency and so on. But I think that is the political. I agree with Rancière and with Chantal Mouffe. I think that, you know, democracy isn't a technocratic image. It's not a machine. It shouldn't have machining. It should be emotional, and it should be about what people want and need and where they see their interests, and it needs to play out. But it needs to, that energy needs to be also institutionalized, because without the institutions, we do have chaos, no doubt about it.
Okay, how can we check and balance the elite and make the elite more accountable?
Well, obviously, in a democracy, we do have the traditional means. We do have political parties, and I'm not that kind of person who says that, you know, there's no difference between the political parties. I think there are incredible difference between political parties, and there's also incredible difference now between presidential candidates. You know, if we look at the upcoming US election, I mean, the sense in which there is a big choice for citizens to make between Trump and Biden is significant, but it's significant maybe in ways like geopolitics, questions about immigration and so on. Obviously, if you're saying, well, which of those candidates supports socialism or, you know, the transformational change to capitalism, you will be disappointed. But we know that in the American political life, there are those candidates out there. I mean, we've had Bernie Sanders standing for presidential election who highlighted those issues. We've got Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, we've got Kennedy, we've got Beto O'Rourke and so on. So it's illusory to imagine that these arguments aren't rehearsed, but it's also illusory to imagine that, you know, that the scales aren't tipped in favor of status quo and in terms of consensus and so on. But I think that is all part of the cut and thrust of democracy. And I'd also point out that we've got many more effective ways of being heard and of getting engaged and participating in democratic life than our forebears. And I'm thinking here about, you know, the 1950s, for example, 1960s, you know, street protests, demonstrations, they may be last resort as far as some democratic theorists are concerned. I'm almost kind of conscious of my former colleague Pippa Norris sitting here going, well, yeah, but elections really are the things that count. Well, we can't imagine that people standing for election are immune to street protests or to mobilizations or to the kind of ruckus that we see around us as regards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example. All of these things, these forms of clamor are ways of being made heard. They are capable of influencing public opinion. And ultimately, we don't really, I think I am a believer that we don't really get social progress simply by trusting political elites and political parties to do the best thing for us. We get progress because those elites come under pressure to respond and react to things that ordinary citizens are articulating as well. So to me, the welfare state, free education, housing, healthcare, these things are the product of a groundswell of popular opinion, sometimes expressed in the ballot box, but also expressed in all sorts of other ways, all sorts of subtle means and not so subtle means that citizens have available to them. And that is the right and proper kind of approach in a democracy. The democracy is not just about putting a a mark on a ballot paper every 4 or 5 years or 3 years in Australia. It's also about people making themselves heard, and they have many opportunities to do that.
Is populism or its right-wing version problematic for social cohesion?
Well, of course, right-wing populists think that their view is that they're in favor of social cohesion. So they think social cohesion is threatened by an influx of refugees, new migrants, people from parts of the world with different kinds of values, whether that's the Middle East or Asia and so on. So their view is that social cohesion is really a kind of a cultural artifact of an indigenous people being able to sort of organize themselves according to a common core of values. I mean, you know, and I think multiculturalism has been the antidote to that, right? So there are very successful multicultural societies, the US amongst them, Canada, Australia, where I'm sitting, as a nation of migrants, essentially. So I think the proper sort of counterbalance is actually to point out the incredible richness and diversity of a contemporary democratic society. But one can also understand the kind of cause of concern that people have about, you know, and that's the kind of debate that we're having at the moment in the UK and in Holland and Belgium and Australia and so on, is that can you have a, you know, is it a critical mass picture, this? Is there an optimal number of people coming into a society before it gets out of control or whatever? I mean, I think we're living in an experiment in transnational populations and movements and flows of people at the moment. But there is also a very serious reaction to that. And we will find out over the next couple of decades, I think, where people are happy to concede that, you know, our societies have been enriched or otherwise. But ultimately, I think this is a kind of a topic for democratic contestation, where people feel that, you know, the balance has tipped too far in terms of open borders and so on. It's creating a hiatus. Here in Australia, the debate is about housing. We haven't got enough housing. Infrastructure lags the sheer number of people coming in and so on. And we'll just have to find a happy medium. I think this is democratic life. People are interested in you know, how many people is enough, basically. But we've also got the problem of aging populations in places like Italy and Japan, parts of Europe, where without immigration, these societies are actually kind of dead in the water. They're not going to be able to pay for their welfare bills. They're old people. They're not going to be able to renew themselves. So I think there is there's an interesting balance here in the argument, isn't there? And you know, we just have to see how democracies are able to cope with this this kind of set of issues, really.
How can liberal democracies tackle with the rising civilizational populism in the US, Russia, India, China, Turkey, and elsewhere?
Well, it's the kind of backlash against globalization argument, isn't it? For 30, 40, 50 years, we've had globalization, we've had relatively porous borders, we've had the ability. I was born in Ireland, I moved to the UK, I moved to Australia, went back to the UK. My kids have all got 3 passports, and that has been a great advantage. But I mean, it's an elite enjoyed advantage at the moment. And I think, you know, the problem is we've got elites arguing against that, even though they themselves enjoy those advantages, including people like Donald Trump with his overseas investments, Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen, and all the rest of it. So I think there is a sort of two-faced aspect to this. But of course, politicians are responding to the demands of their populace to come up with creative solutions to all this. I mean, what I hope is that the wheel turns. I think it will turn, because I think on this matter, sort of economics trumps politics. Clearly, economic globalization and the ability of countries to import and export goods and people from other countries has been a fantastic driver of economic growth across the last half century. And I think that if you look at the relative integration of the US and China, for example, China would have to be really crazy now to want to throw that up in the air by invading Taiwan. The US has made it very clear that that would be very detrimental to their economic relationship. China also holds huge amounts of investments in the US. So you kind of think that even the kind of emerging great power politics that we've got at the moment, Russia, China, India, US, will be domesticated and contained by the economic needs of those countries as well. But, you know, we are kind of on the edge of a precipice, there's no doubt about it, but you kind of have to hope that the economic, business, commercially minded parts of those elites gets the upper hand, and that the aggressive nationalist, nativist parts of the elite populations, which are powerful, no doubt about it, in places like India, China, the US, and so on, they're kind of, you know, outmaneuvered by the economic elites, upon whom many of them depend, of course, for personal favor, for propping up their own political parties, their own elite privileges, and so on. We'll see how we go. But it's a key question for the next part of the 21st century, isn't it?
Lastly, Professor, in a recent New York Times article titled "A New Centrism is Rising in Washington," it is argued that a new centrism is emerging in Washington because neoliberalism has failed to deliver, and both Democrats and Republicans have grown skeptical of free trade. This shift is referred to as neopopulism. Do you agree with the assertion that we are witnessing the dawn of neopopulism?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting article. And of course, people are thinking, well, we had that 30 years really between the early to mid 1970s and then the global financial crisis, where there seemed to be a very strong consensus in favor of free trade, open borders, transnational flows, and so on. And with this kind of current phase, it seems that that has come to an end. And of course, people are using phrases like deglobalization or the new nationalism to describe these kind of features. I mean, I think neoliberalism is more entrenched than this description would allow. I think that the belief in the market, belief in capitalism, belief in the ability of people to place their money and their bets in whatever currency they feel like, the ability to invest in countries here and there in Europe, in China. I think that's very intrinsic to capitalist modernity, and I don't see any real threats to that as a kind of how we actually organize ourselves. I think at that level, then we're sort of kidding ourselves that the politics will trump economics at that particular level. I think, you know, one could start mobilizing Zizek in this regard. We sort of take capitalism for granted as we try to come up with new phrases and coinage for describing the current conjuncture. I think we are just in an era of economic liberalism with great power rivalry. I think I would be more belts and braces. I think John Mearsheimer, who I've been watching a lot recently because he's very controversial, obviously, in the origins of the Ukraine war as well as the rise of China. But I think you can't help thinking that that kind of great power rivalry is probably more important than a neologism or a new ism. I don't think we're heading towards a new kind of consensus of a kind that neopopulism would point to. I think what we're pointing to is a kind of a kind of drawing back of that narrative around globalization, that the differences between countries would be less significant than the similarities. I think the core of a nativist, nationalist, great power rivalry is there and is probably going to dictate whatever political outcomes we would care to predict on for the next 15, 20 years at very least. So I think we're in the shadow of the reemergence of great power rivalry with an undercurrent of kind of economic interconnectedness, some forms of deglobalization, decoupling at the core, and then lots of little regional wars and conflicts to have to manage over the next 15, 20 years. So probably enough to imagine that populism is not going to die, but nor is it going to become a new sort of ideological neo-populism. I'm not a believer in that thesis.
Professor Tormey, thank you so very much for your time.
You're very welcome. It's been a great pleasure.
I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Anytime.
Thank you.